I woke up to a fist pounding on my front door like a police raid. Not a polite knock, not even an irritated knock. The kind of pounding that made the whole frame rattle. I stumbled downstairs, still in pajama pants, opened the door, and was met with the sight of a middle-aged woman with a clipboard tucked under her arm, a purse dangling from her elbow, and an expression that could have curdled milk. She introduced herself as Karen, president of the HOA, and immediately informed me that I had 30 days to vacate the premises. No hello, no explanation, just an eviction notice delivered with the authority of a small-town dictator. I blinked at her. "Excuse me?" I asked, genuinely wondering if this was some kind of prank. She thrust the clipboard at me like it was a sword. "This neighborhood has rules. You've been violating them since you moved in. Illegal fencing, unapproved exterior paint, and don't even get me started on that monstrosity of a truck in your driveway. You should have submitted an application before making these changes. You didn't. You're out." I glanced back at my house. My modest gray siding. My perfectly legal cedar fence. My 12-year-old Ford pickup. The most boring setup imaginable. "Karen," I said, "this house isn't even in the HOA." Her lips curled in a smile that wasn't a smile. "Every house in this subdivision is covered. Don't play dumb. I've been president for 7 years. I know every property." She pushed the clipboard into my chest. "Sign this acknowledgement, and we'll begin the process." It was so surreal I actually laughed, which only made her face tighten until it looked like she'd sucked on a lemon. I refused the clipboard, told her she was mistaken, and shut the door. I thought that would be the end of it. It was not. The next morning, a bright orange notice of violation was duct-taped to my garage. It listed infractions like grass length exceeding HOA standards, improper trash bin storage, and my favorite, display of unauthorized vehicle. My crime? Having my cousin's fishing boat parked in the driveway overnight. I tore the paper down, but by the time I came back from work, there were 2 more, this time stapled to the wooden post by my mailbox. Later that evening, while grilling in my backyard, I noticed Karen on the sidewalk snapping photos of my house with her phone, muttering about documentation. I walked over calmly. "Karen, I'm telling you again. This house is not in your HOA. I checked before I bought it." She barely looked at me. "That's what everyone says when they're trying to cheat the system. We'll see what the fines add up to. Maybe eviction will be quicker." It wasn't just her words that stunned me. It was her certainty, the absolute conviction that she had authority over me. Like some medieval lord exercising dominion over the peasants. She strutted away like she'd won. That's when I decided, fine. If she wanted a battle, she was going to get one. The following day, I dug out my closing paperwork from the purchase of my home. I flipped through the title documents, the covenants, the plat map. And there it was in black and white. My house was built 5 years before the HOA was even established. The original developer never deeded my lot into their association. My property sat exactly 1 street outside their jurisdiction. Karen had absolutely no claim. So, naturally, I made a few copies. 1 for me. 1 for Karen. 1 for the county sheriff, just in case. The next weekend, she escalated. She cornered me while I was mowing my lawn, waving her clipboard like a weapon, yelling loud enough that neighbors peeked through blinds. "You have 2 weeks before I file for lien enforcement," she shrieked. 2 weeks. I stopped the mower, pulled the ear protection down, and handed her a copy of the documents. "Read the second page, Karen. My property isn't in your HOA. Never has been. Never will be." For a split second I saw doubt flicker across her eyes. But then she smirked. "Everyone thinks they're special. You'll see. You'll pay, one way or another." She tore the papers in half, let them scatter into my yard like confetti, and stormed off. At that moment I realized she wasn't just mistaken, she was obsessed. And obsession meant she wasn't going to stop until she either won or embarrassed herself so badly the whole neighborhood turned on her. That night, as I sat on my porch sipping a beer, I decided to make sure it was the second option. Because if Karen was going to insist she had control over my property, then the only logical response was to show her, publicly, unmistakably, that she didn't. And that, right there, was the beginning of the most ridiculous neighborhood war I've ever been part of. When I woke up the next morning, there was a brand new letter shoved halfway under my front door. It wasn't folded, wasn't sealed, just a sheet of paper with a large HOA letterhead across the top, written in bold, indignant print, "Final warning." Underneath it listed a set of fines that, according to Karen's self-appointed math, now totaled over $3,000. The document even had a due date, circled in red ink like she'd personally marched into my house and used my calendar. I sat at the kitchen table staring at the paper, sipping my coffee, torn between laughing and feeling slightly unnerved. The gall it must take to find someone who wasn't even under your jurisdiction. It was almost admirable in a deranged sort of way. I folded it neatly and tucked it into a folder I had begun compiling, labeled Karen vs. Reality. I already had the shredded copy of my deed, screenshots of her texts she somehow got my number for, and photos of her prowling around my yard at night with a flashlight. If this escalated to legal territory, I'd be more than ready. The escalation, of course, came faster than expected. Around noon, I noticed two men in neon safety vests parked out front in a beat-up pickup. They unloaded measuring wheels, clipboards, and a tape measure big enough to lasso a horse. I stepped outside and asked what they were doing. One of them, a guy in his 40s with sunglasses, said they'd been hired by the HOA to assess property violations. "Whose property?" I asked. He gestured toward my house. "Yours." I laughed. "Yeah, no. You're trespassing. This isn't HOA property. Whoever hired you didn't have the authority." They exchanged awkward looks, shrugged, and one of them muttered, "We already got paid." I pulled out my phone and, with deliberate clarity, dialed the sheriff's non-emergency line right in front of them. Within 10 minutes, a deputy pulled up. Karen arrived moments later like she'd been waiting for the cue. She marched straight to the deputy, pointed at me, and launched into a dramatic performance. "This homeowner has refused compliance for months. He's destroying the value of every property in this neighborhood. He thinks he's above the law. We're simply enforcing the rules." The deputy glanced at me, then at her, then back at me. I calmly handed him the folder. "Here are my deed documents. Here are the county records. Here's the part where it shows I'm not in the HOA. She has no authority over my property." The deputy spent a good 5 minutes flipping through the papers while Karen fidgeted like a restless child. When he finally looked up, his voice was flat. "Ma'am, this property is not in your HOA. You have no jurisdiction here. If you continue to harass this homeowner, he can press charges for trespassing and harassment." Her face turned crimson. "That's impossible. Every house here is included. That's what I was told when I moved in." "Then you were misinformed," the deputy said. He handed the folder back to me, tipped his hat, and left. The men in safety vests packed up their gear and drove off without a word. Karen stood in the street for a full minute, glaring at me, her clipboard clutched like it might sprout claws. Then she spun on her heel and stormed away without another word. That evening, my phone buzzed with texts from neighbors. Apparently, Karen had gone door to door ranting about how I was ruining the neighborhood and using a legal loophole to avoid accountability. One neighbor, Greg, texted me, "Don't worry, man. We know you're not in the HOA. She's just mad she can't control you. Half of us are jealous." That's when it clicked. Her entire identity was wrapped up in this HOA presidency. It wasn't just about me. It was about the idea that someone could exist within her sphere of vision but outside her grasp. For someone like Karen, control wasn't optional, it was oxygen. The next weekend, I decided to make things interesting. I hosted a barbecue. Not a little one either. I invited friends, co-workers, and even a couple of the cooler neighbors who'd been sympathetic. We had grills going, music playing, kids running around in the sprinkler, and my cousin backed his fishing boat right into the driveway just to rub it in. It wasn't long before Karen appeared at the curb, phone in hand, recording everything like she was compiling evidence for the Supreme Court. "This is an illegal gathering," she shouted over the music. "Noise violations. Unauthorized vehicles. I'm calling the HOA board." I sauntered to the edge of the lawn with a plate of ribs and a beer, waved, and said loudly enough for everyone to hear, "Karen, sweetheart, I'm not in your HOA. Call whoever you like, but they have as much authority here as the Girl Scouts." Laughter rippled through the party. A few people clapped. Karen's face tightened into a mask of fury. She whipped out her phone, dialed 911, and reported a disturbance. When the same deputy from before showed up, he surveyed the scene. Families eating, kids playing, music at a perfectly reasonable volume, and then sighed. "Ma'am, this is not a police matter. You can't keep calling us every time someone does something you don't like." Karen sputtered. "He's violating the bylaws." The deputy looked at me with a smirk, then turned back to her. "He's not under your bylaws. I already explained that. One more false report and you'll be the one in trouble." She stomped off, muttering something about lawyers. Later that night, after everyone left and I was cleaning up, I noticed something odd. A handwritten note stuck under my windshield wiper. It wasn't signed, but the neat, passive-aggressive script gave it away instantly. It read, "Enjoy your freedom while it lasts. You'll regret crossing me." It wasn't exactly a threat, but it wasn't innocent either. And it confirmed what I already knew. Karen wasn't done. If anything, she was just getting started. I leaned back against my truck, holding the note, and chuckled. Because if she thought I was going to cave, she had no idea who she was dealing with. For the first time since this whole circus began, I realized something that made me grin ear to ear. This wasn't just her game anymore. It was mine too. I woke up the next morning to the sound of hammering. Not the faint thud of someone fixing a fence or building a deck. The sharp, deliberate pounding of wood against wood, coming from directly in front of my property. I threw on a shirt and went outside, only to find Karen in her sun hat, supervising two neighborhood teenagers who were nailing a massive wooden sign into the strip of grass by my driveway. The letters, painted in bold black strokes, read, "Notice. This property is in violation. Fines pending." I stood there for a solid 10 seconds, mouth half open, because the sheer audacity was beyond words. "Morning, Karen," I finally said, my voice calm but laced with sarcasm. "What's this? A new art project?" She turned to me, chin raised, hands clasped like a queen overseeing her subjects. "This is an official warning from the HOA. You're an embarrassment to this neighborhood, and I won't allow you to drag down everyone else's property value with your antics." The teens kept hammering, clearly uncomfortable, shooting me apologetic glances. I walked over, yanked the sign straight out of the ground, and leaned it against the curb. "Two things," I said evenly. "One, if you're going to put something on my property, you'd better bring a building permit. Two, you might want to double-check your jurisdiction, because this still isn't HOA land." Karen's eyes narrowed. "You think you're clever, don't you? Hiding behind technicalities. We'll see how clever you feel when the board meets next week. You'll be fined out of here." I shrugged, carried the sign into my garage, and shut the door in her face. But that little stunt told me two things. She was escalating, and she was dragging kids into her crusade to do the dirty work. That second part bothered me more than the sign itself. She wanted an audience, and she wanted allies. So I decided to make sure she got both. The following evening, I printed large copies of my property's plat map and legal documents. I posted one on my front door and another on my mailbox, laminated against the weather. Across the top, I wrote in bold Sharpie, "This house is not in the HOA." The effect was immediate. Neighbors started slowing down when they walked their dogs. Some chuckled, others gave me thumbs up. A few muttered under their breath about, finally someone standing up to her. Karen, of course, was livid. The very next day, she stormed across my yard waving her clipboard like a scepter. "This is defamation," she shrieked. "You're lying to everyone, and you'll be held accountable for spreading misinformation." I sipped my lemonade on the porch and said, "Defamation would require me to make a false statement. Care to prove me wrong?" I gestured toward the posted documents. "Go ahead, Karen. Show me where it says my property falls under your HOA." She faltered, lips trembling, because of course she couldn't. Her face flushed deep red, and for a second I thought she might actually try to rip the documents down. Instead, she spun around and marched off, calling over her shoulder, "Enjoy your little game. The board will handle you." That night, I received a letter in my mailbox. Not mailed, but hand-delivered. It was addressed to the occupant of 114 Pine Hollow Drive, which wasn't even my house number. The letter accused me of gross misconduct, slander against the HOA, and threatened maximum fines allowable. It was signed only HOA Board. I laughed out loud. The formatting was amateur, riddled with typos, and the wrong address was the cherry on top. It was so obviously Karen that I almost felt embarrassed for her. Almost. But then came the real twist. 2 days later, I noticed a minivan parked across the street with the engine off, windows half rolled down. A man sat inside, scribbling notes on a pad every time I walked outside. I ignored him at first, but after an hour of this, I walked over. "Can I help you?" He introduced himself as a compliance inspector hired by the HOA. His job, apparently, was to record every infraction on my property until I complied. I asked for his ID, and he showed me a business card printed on cheap cardstock with the name, Neighborhood Solutions Enforcement. I had to bite my cheek to keep from laughing. "Listen," I said, "you might want to check who hired you. Because if it was Karen, she just paid you to trespass. My house isn't in the HOA, and if you don't leave, I'll call the sheriff." Again. His face paled, and without another word, he started the van and drove off. By this point, the neighborhood was buzzing. Karen's war against me had become a public spectacle. People whispered on sidewalks, shared popcorn-worthy updates, and one guy even started a group chat titled Karen Chronicles, where neighbors traded stories of her antics. Someone shared a photo of her pacing my lawn with a tape measure at midnight. Another caught her rifling through trash bins, supposedly looking for illegal waste. And yet, despite the mounting embarrassment, she doubled down. The following Saturday, she called an emergency HOA meeting at the community center. I wasn't invited, of course, but Greg from down the street texted me play-by-play updates. Apparently, she spent 40 minutes ranting about me, accusing me of being a squatter, a con artist, and even suggesting I was falsifying government records. When another board member suggested maybe I truly wasn't under HOA jurisdiction, she exploded, accusing him of being complicit. The board, from what Greg told me, looked increasingly uncomfortable. But Karen had always ruled with sheer persistence, wearing people down until they gave in. This time, though, she'd picked the wrong target. The next morning, I printed 50 flyers, each with a copy of my property documents and the bold title, "My home is not in the HOA. Ask to see the paperwork yourself." I distributed them to every mailbox in the neighborhood. By the time the sun went down, I'd gotten at least a dozen thank you texts. Karen, however, was silent. No pounding on the door. No clipboard in sight. For a moment, I wondered if I'd finally shut her down. But late that night, while I was brushing my teeth, I caught the reflection of flashing lights through my bathroom window. Blue and red. I rushed downstairs and stepped outside to find 2 police cars parked at the curb. Karen was standing there, arms crossed, smug as could be, telling the officers that I was hosting illegal parties again and disturbing the peace. Except the street was silent, my house was dark, and I was in pajamas. The officers asked me a few polite questions, glanced around, and quickly realized it was a false report. They gave me a sympathetic look, then warned Karen that filing false claims could land her with a fine or worse. She stammered excuses, tried to drag out her argument, but they weren't having it. They told her to go home. And for the first time since this whole circus began, I saw it, the crack in her armor. The look of someone realizing she wasn't untouchable anymore. I stood there in the cool night air, watching her retreat, and thought. The game had officially shifted. Because now it wasn't just me versus Karen. It was Karen versus the truth. And the truth had finally started to win. 2 days of quiet passed, and for a brief, fleeting moment I wondered if maybe Karen had finally surrendered. No pounding on my door, no neon notices duct taped to the siding, no hired inspectors loitering in vans. But if there's one thing I'd learned by then, it was that Karen didn't quit. She regrouped, and when she returned with theater. On the third morning, I opened my blinds to find a cluster of cars parked along the curb. Folding chairs were arranged on the sidewalk in front of my house, like some kind of bizarre neighborhood court. Karen stood in the center with her ever-present clipboard, flanked by 3 board members who looked like they'd been blackmailed into showing up. She'd even set up a microphone attached to a little battery-powered speaker. "This hearing will now come to order," she announced, voice echoing down the street. I opened my front door, coffee mug in hand, and leaned casually against the frame. "Karen," I called, "what in God's name are you doing?" She ignored me. "This homeowner has repeatedly violated community standard. Today, the board will vote to impose maximum penalties and proceed with lien enforcement. Witnesses may speak now." Several neighbors sat uncomfortably in their folding chairs, clearly they're out of morbid curiosity more than loyalty. Greg stood across the street filming the whole thing on his phone. "Karen," I said louder, walking toward the curb, "we've been over this. I'm not in your HOA. None of this means anything." One of the board members muttered something about not wanting to be there, but Karen silenced him with a glare sharp enough to cut glass. She pointed at me like she was Judge Judy herself. "Failure to appear in front of the board is itself a violation. You are already in default." At that point, I actually laughed. I set my coffee mug on the mailbox, walked back inside, and came out with a lawn chair of my own. I unfolded it right next to their makeshift tribunal, sat down, and said, "By all means, continue. This should be entertaining." Karen puffed up like a peacock. She launched into a monologue about community values, rule of law, and the sanctity of shared standards. She listed my infractions like a prosecutor reading charges: the truck, the fence, the non-existent paint violations, the illegal parties. When she finished, she demanded the board vote. One man raised his hand halfway, then lowered it again. Another pretended to tie his shoe. The third said flatly, "Karen, he's not in the HOA. We can't vote on this." Her face contorted. "We can and we will. He is a menace." That's when I decided to end the charade. I pulled out a folder, stood up, and handed copies of my documents to the nearest neighbors. "Ladies and gentlemen, the legal proof. My property was built before the HOA existed. It has never been part of it. Karen has been harassing me under false pretenses. I invite any of you to check county records yourselves." A murmur spread through the little crowd. People whispered, heads tilted, and I could see the balance shift. One woman asked if this was true, and another man confirmed he'd checked the county's online portal after my flyers. Sure enough, my house wasn't listed. Karen's voice rose, brittle and shrill. "He's lying. He fabricated those documents. He's tricking all of you." Greg finally called out from across the street. "Karen, it's on the county website. Anybody with Wi-Fi can look it up. You're busted." Laughter broke out. Real, audible laughter from multiple neighbors. Karen froze, clipboard trembling in her hands. For the first time, she seemed cornered. The hearing ended not with a bang, but with neighbors quietly folding up their chairs and drifting away. The board members slipped off, muttering excuses. Karen stood alone in the middle of the sidewalk, staring at me like I'd just stolen her crown. But if she was embarrassed, she masked it quickly. She marched up to me, close enough I could smell the perfume and tension radiating off her. "This isn't over," she hissed. "If the board won't act, I'll take you to court." I smiled politely. "Please do. I'd love to watch a judge explain jurisdiction to you." She stormed off, heels clicking against the pavement, leaving only the faint echo of her fury. I thought maybe, just maybe, the public humiliation might slow her down. But that evening, I found out how wrong I was. At 10:47 p.m., my power cut out. Entire house pitch black. My first thought was a blown fuse. But when I checked, the breaker box was fine. Stepping outside with a flashlight, I noticed something more sinister. The locked panel near the side of my house, the one with my power meter, had been pried open. And standing at the edge of my property, half hidden in the shadows, was Karen. Clipboard under her arm, phone in hand, whispering frantically to someone. When my flashlight beam caught her, she froze like a raccoon in headlights, then bolted. I didn't chase her. I didn't yell. I simply snapped a photo with my phone. Her face, the open panel, the timestamp glowing at the top. Then I called the sheriff. The same deputy arrived within 20 minutes. He took one look at the panel, one look at the photo, and sighed deeply. "She's really determined, isn't she?" I nodded. "If she keeps escalating, someone's going to get hurt." He filed a report, promised to forward it to the county attorney, and stayed until the power company restored my service. By the time I finally crawled into bed, exhaustion washed over me like a wave. But underneath the fatigue, something else stirred. A kind of grim determination. Karen had crossed the line from nuisance into criminal. And if she thought I'd back down, she hadn't learned a thing. The next day, I printed out the photo of her at my power box and distributed it around the neighborhood. "Caught tampering with utilities," the caption read. The effect was nuclear. People who'd tolerated her antics before were suddenly furious. One neighbor stormed down to her house demanding answers. Another texted me that she was considering a petition to remove Karen from the board. Karen retaliated by filing what she called a formal lawsuit. She served me with a packet of papers herself, dropping them dramatically on my porch like she was starring in a legal drama. But when I flipped through them, they weren't real court documents at all, just pages of HOA bylaws photocopied, highlighted, and stapled together with a cover sheet labeled Notice of Pending Action. It was theater, nothing more. I almost felt pity for her then. Almost. But any trace of pity vanished that evening when I came home to find a giant, "For sale" sign staked into my lawn. The words, "Property seized by HOA," were scrawled in red paint across the board. I yanked it out, carried it to her yard, and left it leaning against her mailbox like a returned package. A few neighbors clapped from their porches. That night, I sat on my porch and realized something important. Up until now, I'd been reacting, responding to her provocations, parrying each new attack. But what if I stopped reacting? What if I went on offense, turned her obsession into her undoing? Because the truth was, she thrived on control, on the illusion of authority. And if I pulled that illusion out from under her in front of everyone, she'd have nothing left. I leaned back in my chair, sipping a cold beer under the quiet night sky, and smiled. The real war hadn't even begun. And this time, I wasn't just going to defend my house. I was going to take down her little empire, once and for all. The morning after the seizure sign incident, I woke up with a clarity I hadn't felt since the whole debacle began. Up until now, I'd been letting Karen dictate the tempo. She threw punches, I blocked. She hurled lies, I corrected them. She set fires, I put them out. But the best way to deal with someone who thrived on conflict wasn't to dodge their blows, it was to let them exhaust themselves swinging. So I decided my final move would be to let her dig her own grave, while making sure the entire neighborhood had a front row seat. I started with the paper trail. That morning, I drove down to the county clerk's office. With a small fee and a patient clerk who clearly knew the Karen type, I got certified copies of my deed, my plat map, and the incorporation documents for the HOA itself, showing the date of formation, 5 years after my house was built. When I asked for extra stamps of authenticity, the clerk smirked. "Dealing with someone difficult?" she asked. I just nodded. By noon, I had a neat binder filled with indisputable proof. I could have just held on to it until Karen tried her next stunt, but I wanted something more dramatic, something that would dismantle her authority in one public, irreversible stroke. So I made flyers again. Not just a few this time, every single house in the neighborhood got one. Each flyer was simple. Facts about 112 Maple Drive across the top, followed by 3 bullet points of legal text, and a copy of the stamped county records. At the bottom I wrote, "This property is not and has never been under HOA jurisdiction. Any claims to the contrary are false. Ask to see the certified documents yourself." By the time I got home from delivering them, I already had 2 neighbors on my porch thanking me. One man shook my hand and said, "About time someone stood up to her." Another admitted she'd been afraid to challenge Karen for years because she didn't want to get fined. Word was spreading, and with it, a shift in power I could feel like the first tremor before an earthquake. Karen, of course, exploded. That evening, she marched up my driveway with her clipboard in one hand and my flyer crumpled in the other. She was shaking so hard I thought she might burst a vein. "You can't distribute this garbage," she screeched. "It's libel. Do you even know what libel is?" I sipped my beer and gestured at the stamp. "Certified documents, Karen. Straight from the county clerk. Hard to libel the truth." She shrieked, stomped her foot like a furious child, and stormed off without another word. That was the moment I knew she was cornered. And cornered animals lash out. Sure enough, the next day she escalated again. Around noon, I heard the rumble of a tow truck outside. I looked out to see a driver hooking up chains to my cousin's boat in my driveway. Karen stood nearby, arms folded, nodding like a general inspecting her troops. I jogged outside. "Excuse me, what do you think you're doing?" The tow truck driver shrugged. "Got a call from the HOA. Said this was an unauthorized vehicle, needs to be removed." I whipped out my phone, dialed the sheriff's office, and put the call on speaker. While waiting, I told the driver, "You so much as scratch that boat, and you'll be personally liable. This is private property, not HOA." When the deputy arrived, he was the same man who'd been out here twice before. He took one look at the scene, sighed, and asked Karen, "Ma'am, did you authorize this tow?" "Yes," she barked. "As president of the HOA, I have every right." The deputy shook his head. "Not here, you don't. This house isn't in your HOA. You've been warned multiple times. You need to leave right now, or I'll place you under arrest for harassment and attempted theft." Her jaw dropped. "Arrest? You can't arrest me. I'm the president." "Exactly why I can," he said dryly. "You've abused your position long enough." For a moment, time froze. Everyone on the street, because of course neighbors had come out to watch, stared as the deputy pulled out his handcuffs. Karen shrieked, twisted, and then burst into tears. Real tears, the kind of messy sobbing that made her mascara run. "I was just trying to protect the neighborhood," she wailed. "I gave up my time, my energy, everything for these ungrateful people." The deputy was patient but firm. "And in doing so, you crossed the line. Multiple times." He didn't cuff her, though the sight of him holding them was enough, but he did escort her back to her house, warning her that if she stepped onto my property again, she'd face actual charges. The tow truck driver unhooked the boat sheepishly and left without another word. The crowd dispersed, murmuring, buzzing with gossip. But the damage was done. Karen had been humiliated, not by me this time, but by law enforcement in front of the entire block. And yet, even then, she wasn't finished. That night, I found one last note taped to my door. Her handwriting again, unmistakable. It read, "Enjoy your little victory. This neighborhood will rot without order. Don't say I didn't warn you." I tore it down, tossed it in the trash, and sat on the porch under the stars. For the first time in weeks, I felt a calmness settle over me. She was done. Maybe not in her own mind. People like Karen rarely admit defeat, but in the eyes of the neighborhood, her power was gone. Over the next few weeks, the change was palpable. Without Karen's iron grip, neighbors started talking more openly. Families that had kept their heads down began hosting block parties. People repainted their mailboxes in whatever colors they wanted. One man put up a basketball hoop in his driveway without filling out a form in triplicate. Life felt freer. Then came the final nail in the coffin. At the next HOA board election, Karen tried to run unopposed, as she always had. But this time, half the neighborhood showed up, emboldened by everything that had happened. Someone nominated Greg on the spot, and when the votes were counted, Karen lost in a landslide. She stormed out of the community center, her clipboard clutched like a broken shield, while neighbors applauded her exit. I didn't even attend. I was at home, grilling with friends, sipping a cold drink, watching kids ride their bikes up and down the street without a care. When Greg stopped by later to tell me the news, I simply nodded. "Good," I said. "Now maybe we can all breathe again." But the real victory wasn't that Karen had been dethroned. It wasn't that she'd been exposed, humiliated, or even legally warned. The real victory was that the neighborhood had woken up. They'd realized they didn't need someone barking orders to live peacefully. They just needed a little perspective, and maybe one stubborn homeowner willing to stand his ground. Weeks later, I caught sight of Karen one last time. She was out on her lawn, trimming her hedges alone, no clipboard, no audience, no power. Our eyes met briefly, and for the first time, she didn't glare. She just looked tired, deflated, maybe even human. I raised my hand in a small wave. She didn't wave back, but she didn't scowl either. She just turned back to her hedges and kept clipping. And that was fine by me. Because sometimes, the best revenge isn't crushing your enemy. Sometimes it's simply outlasting them. And in the end, I had outlasted her. My home was still mine. My peace was restored. And Karen, queen of nothing, was left with nothing but her clippers, her lawn, and the memory of the war she started but couldn't win.